Good evening and welcome to the third ICG 2020's Development Dialogue. We have with us Dr. Shekhar Mande, Director General of CSIR, Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, with us today. He'll be in conversation with Mr. Dattaraj Salgaonkar, Vice President, International Center Goa. The conversation is organized around the theme of rise of India's science and technology in the fight against COVID-19. Before we begin, I would like to invite Mr. Yatin Kakodkar, President of ICG, to make his introductory remarks. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the International Center Goa and to the third webinar program of the series 2020's Development Dialogue. The topic today is the rise of Indian science and technology in the fight against COVID-19. COVID-19 has devastated the health and wealth of millions of people worldwide. There have been 108 million cases globally, including 11 million cases in India. 2.4 million have died, including 1.56 lakhs in our country. We grieve the lives that have been lost and are mindful of the sufferings and hardship faced by millions. About 11 months ago, there was a state of panic in the country as the virus began to spread. Even as words like lockdown, comorbidity, social distancing, work from home, contact tracing entered the common parlance, there was a widespread fear that India would be the worst affected nation in the world due to its huge population, poverty, poor sanitation, and an underfunded and underdeveloped healthcare system. Today, though the pandemic is far from over, and it could still get worse, it is safe to say that India has avoided the second wave of COVID-19, unlike some rich countries of the Western world. Relatively speaking, India has fared better than some developed countries. Why is this so? The Economic Survey 2021 says that the timely and stringent initial lockdown in the summer of last year saved lives by pushing the peak of the pandemic to September. Some scientists express the view that Indians have a strong immune system and hence can resist COVID-19 better than people in high-income countries. Some scientists say that due to hygiene issues, Indians can deal with the pathogens better than people in rich countries. Some opine that the population of India comprises a large percentage of young people who can fight the virus better. Sero studies by some agencies estimate that about half the population of India or more has already been infected in India, thus narrowing the pathway for the second wave. However, more than chance and good luck, India's science and technology sector has made a concerted effort to fight the pandemic. When the pandemic broke out, there was only one testing laboratory in the country. Within a few months, India set up 1,500 testing laboratories and ramped up diagnostic testing. From an initial situation of shortages, India stepped up its production of testing kits, reagents and chemicals, sanitizers, PPE kits, ventilators, and oxygen meters. The network of primary healthcare centers was effectively mobilized in the task of contact tracing. Science and technology sector has also been successful in the development, manufacture, and distribution of vaccines. Leading the fight against COVID-19 is the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, commonly known as CSIR. It is India's premier science and technology organization with a strong research and development base. CSIR has 38 national research laboratories spread throughout the length and breadth of the country. It has 4,600 active scientists and 8,000 scientific and technical staff. CSIR is a pioneer of India's intellectual property movement. On average, CSIR files about 200 Indian patents and 250 foreign patents per year. The scientific staff of CSIR constitute about 3 to 4% of India's scientific manpower, but they contribute to 10% of India's scientific output. CSIR works with government agencies, private industry, Ministry of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises, and public sector undertakings for scaling up and deployment of technologies and products. To give some insights into the pandemic in general and the role of Indian science and technology in the fight against COVID-19, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Shekhar Mande. Dr. Mande is Secretary, Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and Director General of CSIR. Before taking up his current position, he was Director, National Center for Cell Science, Pune. He obtained his BSc and MSc from Nagpur University before earning a PhD from the Indian Institute of Science. Dr. Mandey has several awards and fellowships to his credit. He is a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Indian Academy of Sciences. He has also been a Wellcome Trust Fellow. Dr. Mandey is an awardee of the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Biological Sciences. In conversation with Dr. Mandey is Mr. Dattaraj Salgaonkar. Mr. Salgaonkar is the chairman of the VM Salgaonkar Corporation Private Limited. He has successfully led the Goa-based group to diversify into real estate, hospitality, and private equity. He is passionate about education in the arts, and his foundation runs schools and colleges in Goa in English and in local Konkani, including higher education from hospitality to a law college. He's a production engineer from VJTI Bombay University and an MBA from Wharton Business School. He founded the Sunapran Goa Center for the Arts in 2007, which focuses on arts-based community and pedagogical programming, which has transformed the Goan cultural landscape. Mr. Salgaonkar is a founder member of ICG and presently is our vice president. He now chairs the ICG Programs Committee and has been the driving force behind our ICG Zoom webinars. Before we start the session today, I'm pleased to announce that our next webinar program will be held in the second half of March next month and will feature India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. I now hand over the session to Mr. Salgaonkar, and I hope you find it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Yatin, for your introductory remarks, and welcome, Dr. Mandey. In fact, it's a great honor and pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for making time for us from an incredibly busy schedule to be with us today. So let me dive straight in, Dr. Mandey, into the questions to you. It's almost been 12 months since COVID-19 struck India, and millions of lives have been altered or affected, either directly or indirectly. Can you tell us, Dr. Mandey, about where we are with the virus today?
Thank you, Mr. Salgaonkar. First of all, it's a great privilege for me to be able to be with you this evening. Thank you all for inviting me here for the same. Now, today's situation, as we see in India, the numbers have been steadily declining. We had our peak in the second half of September, and since then, numbers have steadily declined. In fact, in August and September, there was a bit worrying situation when every day we were reporting something like 90,000 to about 100,000 cases per day. But that number thankfully now has dropped down to about 10,000 to 12,000 per day. There are multiple reasons behind this. Many of the reasons are speculative, so we will not go into them. But in pockets, the numbers have been rising of late, and that's a bit of a concern for all of us. For example, in Kerala and some parts of Maharashtra, the numbers have increased in the past few days, and that might be a reflection of the fact that people have become complacent and people probably believe that the worst is behind us. And through the forum that what we are here today, I would sincerely appeal to all our listeners that the worst is not over, and unless we follow due diligence, unless we follow all the precautions, we'll not be able to get over the pandemic so easily. Mr. Salgaonkar? Yeah.
So pandemics have been with us throughout human history. In the recent past, we had the Spanish flu with over they say 20 million deaths and has claimed a lot of lives. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has already taken 2.5 million lives. I mean, out of which I'm told around 1.5 lakh is from India. So how is this particular pandemic different from all the other influenza, flus, and other pandemics?
So, see, the pandemic during the evolution of Earth have been there since the inception of life. Even much before human beings came into being, there has always been a predator-prey relationship that has existed between different life forms. Even the tiny bacteria that we see are susceptible to what are called as bacteriophages. And that's the predator-prey relationship that exists between many different kinds of organisms. The human race itself, since its evolution, has seen many diseases. but the pandemics and the epidemics became more prevalent ever since we started forming colonies. About 11 to 15,000 years ago, when human beings started cultivation of agriculture and so on and so forth, and started forming colonies, the diseases which transmit from one individual to another, they became more prevalent, right? Now, we have seen multiple pandemics through the history. There have been plague, there's been a black plague, tuberculosis, white plague, what we call as a plague, and so on and so forth. You rightly mentioned 1918, 1919 was a Spanish flu, which killed a huge amount of people. About 1/3 of the world's population was infected with Spanish flu then in 1918, 1919. Now, in some sense, coronavirus is different. Some sense it's similar. We have seen the severe acute respiratory syndrome in the Southeast Asian countries about 10, 15 years ago. 15 years ago, there was an epidemic of SARS-CoV. It's called coronavirus because it looks like a corona. It has a lipid membrane. And on the surface, you have these spikes coming out, looks like a corona. And therefore, it's called coronavirus. A cousin of this is also what is called as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS-CoV. That's much more deadly than SARS-CoV-2. Very, very deadly. So, but thankfully, it has not become a pandemic. It has been restricted to a particular region. Now, the pandemic is different in the sense that you asked me, because we have been priding ourselves for last about 30, 40, 50 years that the healthcare system has advanced so much that we'll be able to deal with any kind of situation or emergency that arises. But the current pandemic is a grim reminder that's not the case. When we have been expecting the next pandemic just around the corner, we have been found to be wanting in all respects. In fact, the most advanced nations, the nations which have prided themselves with having the most advanced healthcare systems, have been worst affected. And that's a very, very grim reminder that such kind of pandemics will continue hitting us, will continue hitting humanity, and we better be prepared for them right now, even for the future pandemics. Mr. Salgaonkar.
So is there any consensus now that how this COVID-19 particularly spreads, and how can it be prevented? And because we hear a lot of mutant strains of this particular COVID-19, and especially the South African strain and the British Kent strain, which is supposed to be quite deadly, and how to combat it. The vaccines have to be, they say, given booster shots and all. So is there some consensus that how this thing mutates and spreads?
Yes, so mutations are known, of course. Mutations have long been known. Even before the pandemic came, we knew that if there is a next viral pandemic, there will be mutations. Mutation is a natural process. When the virus enters the body, it makes millions of copies of itself in our body. And every time it makes a copy of itself, there is a chance of a mutation that would accumulate. Now, what happens is that body also launches an immune response against the virus. And therefore, the mutations which are best adapted to survive against that immune response are the ones that proliferate, right? This is a very natural process that there would be mutations, random mutations in any organism for that matter, not only a virus. And those mutations survive, which are best adapted to survive in that particular environmental or contextual, whatever it is. So that's a natural process. But as far as how the virus spreads, we have actually understood a great deal in last 1 year. And I'll make a bit provocative statements. Please bear me with that. Some of it is personal opinion, some of it is considered opinion of the scientific community. Now, the personal opinion and a large section of the scientists do believe that a virus spreads essentially through aerosols, or the droplets, what we call droplet nuclei. So when we are speaking, we actually are emitting lots of aerosols through our mouth. When we speak loudly, we even do more. When we sing, there's even more. And these droplet nuclei, they contain the entrapped virus, which is actually exists in the upper respiratory tract. When an infected individual has virus in the upper respiratory tract, in the nose, in the mouth, and so on and so forth, and the virus gets entrapped in these nuclei, and when we speak, these nuclei are emitted, exhaled from us, and they remain hanging in air for quite a while. If at that time a healthy individual inhales those nuclei, now is susceptible to have contacted a virus, right? I mean, that's the most consensus view that has emerged. Now, WHO has steadfastly maintained that the virus is not airborne. So what I described to you just now is a process called airborne infection. WHO has for some reason maintained it's not airborne, but many of us believe that WHO's position is rather rigid and not rational. WHO believes that it spreads through contaminated surfaces. A large body of scientific opinion today says that more than contaminated surfaces, it spreads through the air, right, through droplet nuclei. Now let us face this particular aspect. Now, therefore, it's natural that in open, well-ventilated area, the droplet nuclei or the aerosols, they would dissipate very easily. They will not remain hanging in one place and they would actually dissipate very quickly. On the other hand, in less ventilated places, in closed areas, they would remain hanging for a long time. And in fact, we have now proven it. Our two labs, CCMB Hyderabad and IMTech Chandigarh, have scientifically proven that if an infected individual exists in a room, let us say 10 by 10 feet, there would be plenty of droplet nuclei that remain hanging or suspended in the air for a while, right? And therefore, a healthy individual entering that room would now be susceptible for infection. And therefore, we have been always telling people that please avoid less ventilated areas, please prefer open areas. Similarly, if there are more number of individuals who are infected, there will be more droplet nuclei floating around in the air. And therefore, we must avoid gathering of people, whatever the functions may be, whether it be religious, whether it be social, whatever. As long as we are able to avoid gatherings, we reduce the probability of having these droplet nuclei in air, and therefore we reduce the probability of infecting others. So now coming to the question of mutations and vaccines and all, it's a very relevant question. As I said, mutation is a natural process. Viruses would accumulate mutations, and those mutations which survive the best, they would proliferate. As you would have heard in the early part of the pandemic last year, there was a talk of a mutation called D614G that actually became prevalent around the world, and that spread quite widely across the world. And in fact, that took over the earlier virus that was spreading across. But over a period of time, the virus has started accumulating many other mutations. In the UK strain, what is typically called as N501 is also called as V1 or B117. This has actually accumulated something like a large number of mutations, which is a bit concerning. It appears that at one point of time, by a chance event, the virus accumulated very large number of mutations, about 17 of them on the protein which interacts with human cells, the spike protein that interacts with the human cells. And therefore, it was a bit worrying that what this mutant would do. And indeed, it was shown later that this mutant has the ability to spread quicker. In a sense, if we assume that one person had ability to transmit virus to 10 other people, 10 healthy people, this particular mutant, a person would have ability to transmit to about 15 or 16 people. So this mutant actually spreads faster, quicker to other people. But whether the ability to spread more and whether it's more lethal, they're two different issues. And yet the final word is not out whether the mutant is more lethal or not. Whether one person being infected by this new mutant virus, whether that person is more likely to die of this particular mutation is not very clear. It's clear there's more transmissible, but it's not clear whether it's more lethal. Now about the vaccines against the mutants, it's a very relevant point, and at that point, many people actually have curiosity whether vaccination would protect you against the mutant also or not. What happens is that...
I think, Dr. Mande, what we can do is we can go to the vaccines itself, I think, before we go to the vaccine. So my question would be that, from what I understand, there are 4 types of vaccines. You have the whole virus, the protein subunit, the viral vector, and the nucleic acid. So could you just explain these types of vaccines, because a lot of our people may not know, and coming from you, it would be great that there are 4 vaccines, and what does each one do, and how about their efficacy of each, and then we'll talk about the vaccines against the mutants, if you don't mind.
Perfect, perfect. I think what you're saying is absolutely makes sense that we first talk about the vaccines. See, what happens is that a vaccine is that entity which prepares our body's immunity to fight when it actually sees the correct infection, right? So let us take the case of SARS-CoV-2. a vaccine actually would prepare our body before SARS-CoV-2 is encountered by our body. All right. So the body does that by eliciting immune response. Right. The body has a natural immune defense against any invading pathogen. Now, if we prepare our body for SARS-CoV-2, there will be multiple ways that we can prepare our body for SARS-CoV-2. Basically, we have to fool the body's immune system that a virus is going to look like it when your body actually encounters the real virus. So that immune system is now prepared for looking at the actual virus. You can take the whole virus as it is, and you can inactivate it. Right? It's a heat inactivated virus. For example, what Bharat Biotech has done, or what we call as Covaxin, is an inactivated virus. So they have cultured a virus in certain cells, and after culturing virus in those cells, they inactivated using heat, so that when you inject this inactivated virus in our body, the virus will not multiply in our body, but yet the body's immune system would be trained against this particular inactivated virus. And therefore, when actual SARS-CoV-2 comes, CoV-2 enters our body, the body would immediately launch an attack and get rid of the virus. So that's one way of actually priming our body. The second way would be the virus itself has many different components. As I said, it has a lipid surface and has spikes coming out of it. Now, spike is a protein, and that spike is the one which is responsible for attaching the virus to the human cells. Then the spike attaches to human cells, and then human cells actually internalize the virus, and then they starts replicating within a cell in our body. Now, if you actually have only the spike protein and inject that into a human being, the human immune system once again will react to this spike protein, and there will be antibodies generated against this spike protein. Therefore, when the actual virus enters the body, these antibodies would already neutralize the spike so that the spike protein and the virus cannot enter our human cells. So there is another approach, and typically AstraZeneca vaccine that you have heard of, that is being developed by, also conducted by Serum Institute of India in this thing, that is the spike protein that is made artificially in certain cells, but only the spike protein. There's only a small component of the virus that is being taken, and it is attached to what is called as an adenovirus vector. Adenovirus is some kind of a common cold virus, and that elicits a very strong immune response in the body. Therefore, you take a spike protein, attach it to the adenovirus, and inject it into our body. So body now is primed to actually look at the spike protein, and thereby when entire virus enters the body, it is primed to actually have immune response against the whole virus. The nucleic acid viruses, nucleic acid vaccines are of two different kinds. One is the DNA, of course, that Zydus Cadila is developing in Ahmedabad, the DNA-based vaccine, and that would be delivered through a skin patch, and that's a different kind of a virus. But a very exciting development that has taken place in the last about 10-15 years, and it was rather unsung. The people who developed this particular approach called messenger RNA, or in short, mRNA-based vaccines, they were rather unsung heroes until COVID period came up. And the mRNA vaccines have been developed by two principal companies. They haven't received approval in India yet, but we are trying our best at this moment. How do we bring these companies to India? One of them is, of course, Pfizer, that you would have heard of, and other is called Moderna. So both these companies have developed an mRNA-based vaccine. Now, mRNA essentially, as I told you about the spike protein that attaches to human cell surface, the protein in any cell is made from the genetic material. Typically in human body is DNA, but between DNA and protein, there is an intermediate step called RNA, right? So the DNA is always encoded into an RNA, and the RNA then encodes itself into a protein. So that RNA is called as the messenger RNA. And the virus, therefore, also the spike protein, has a messenger RNA that has information to make the spike protein. What these two companies do, Pfizer and Moderna, is they take the mRNA of the spike protein, exactly the mRNA that corresponds to the spike protein, encapsulated in lipid nanoparticles. Lipid nanoparticles are the particles which have the ability to fuse with our own cells, right? And these encapsulated particles are injected into our body. Now, what happens is our body is now fooled because it sees that mRNA, and our body cells then start actually making copies of the spike protein from the mRNA that has been injected. So body cell machinery is essentially some sort of a fooling of the system. So it makes the spike protein. But as soon as the spike protein comes into blood circulation, this particular spike protein, the immune system reacts to it, our body's immune system. And therefore, we generate large number of antibodies against this spike protein that has been injected in our body. And these antibodies are now very useful when the actual virus is encountered by the body. So when the real virus comes in our body, these antibodies would immediately launch an attack on the virus and get rid of the virus. Now that's how essentially all the vaccines actually work. That's the basic principle. Now asking the question, how do the mutants affect the vaccination strategy? Is there an effective way of dealing with the mutants? Now, remember,
efficacy, before that, the efficacy, Dr. Mandi, I mean, the efficacy of each, we hear so many things. So before we go to the mutant, what is the efficacy of, say, the mRNA versus viral vector or whole virus? We have, right from Pfizer, which is mRNA, we have Oxford, which is more the adenovirus, and then we have the Sputnik, and we have the Chinese. So what is their efficacy? And of course, we have our own indigenously developed vaccines. So efficacy.
Okay, I will give you an example of Moderna. Let us take numbers. Now, when we do clinical trials, what we do is we take a vaccine candidate. We tell the regulators that this vaccine candidate has been proven to be safe. So we have to prove that it is safe for injection. And then we have to show that it elicits good immune response in the body. That is called as a phase 1 and phase 2, some sort of a thing, phase 2A. Once we have done that, the regulator gives approval for conducting phase 3. Now in a phase 3 trials, you have large number of healthy volunteers, healthy people, right? And they don't have any comorbidities and things like that. Now in the case of Moderna, they took something like about 20-30,000 volunteers and they injected the candidate into these volunteers. And then they waited for the next few months before some number of volunteers actually developed real COVID-19, symptoms of COVID-19. So they waited till about 196 people developed COVID-19 symptoms, all right, despite vaccination. Now, when we actually vaccinate healthy individuals, this is typically a blinded study. Some people are given actual vaccine and some people are given placebo. Right? The placebo is not a vaccine, but just a thing which will does no harm to the body. So 196 people developed COVID. Out of this, about 20,000 people who have been vaccinated. At that time, Moderna approached a regulator and said that all the data about who has been given the vaccine and who has been given the placebo is sealed in an envelope. Allow us to open the envelope and assess our results. So when the results were assessed, when the envelopes were opened, it turned out that out of 196, 185 were those which had received a placebo, 185. Only 11 of those were the ones who have been given vaccine. So this number translates to about 94% efficacy. You can imagine 185 people developed this thing because of placebo. Only 11 developed because of the actual vaccine. So that turns out to be about 94% efficacy of the virus. And therefore, it's very exciting. Similarly, for AstraZeneca, if 100 people, about 170 people developed COVID-19, about 100 out of them had been, about 130 people developed COVID-19, 100 of them had placebo and 30 of them had the vaccine. And therefore, efficacy is about 70%. Now, this is efficacy. Efficacy is developed, calculated based on healthy individuals. When we come into actual field, there are many people who are elderly, who have comorbidities and so on and so forth. And therefore, there the protection would be different than the efficacy. And that is what is called as effectiveness. So the effectiveness number in actual field might be different than the efficacy numbers. So that's the thing that is different. There's efficacy and effectiveness is different. And that's how the efficacy of a virus is calculated, of a vaccine is calculated, that large number of people who have been given the vaccine during trials are seen to be protected when they actually don't develop the actual disease. That's how it is actually calculated.
Thank you. Then the mutant, now we'll come to the mutant and vaccine.
That's right. So in a mutation, what happens is that the mutations typically happen in the regions which are selected. As I told you, mutations are random, but those mutants that proliferate, which are selected for survival in human host. And therefore, it is natural to believe that a lot of mutations will arise on the spike protein, right? Now, virus has a coat and many spike proteins on the surface. Spike protein has a few mutations here and there. But the body's immune system actually looks at the whole virus as it is. The immune system of the body has generated antibodies against the whole viral particle. It's not only on the small region of the spike protein or something. So the antibodies exist against the entire virus from all different aspects. Antibodies see the entire virus in its entity. But the mutations in spike proteins are in localized regions here and there. And therefore, what the scientific community would like to believe is that despite the virus being mutated, antibodies would still recognize the virus, and therefore the vaccines would still be effective, as long as there are not a large number of mutations that are accumulated in the virus. What happens in influenza and all like that every year, when the influenza every year comes seasonal flu, that influenza virus has already accumulated a very large number of mutations. And what it actually leads to what we call as antigenic drift. And the body's immune system don't actually recognize the last year's influenza virus that came and this year's influenza virus that is there. And therefore, we have to actually take a seasonal shot of influenza vaccine. In SARS-CoV-2, as of now, we don't have any evidence to believe that such a big antigenic drift is taking place. And therefore, we consider ourselves lucky that although there are mutations, the vaccines are still effective against the mutants. Mrs. Salgaonkar.
Okay, thank you. One of the things which even WHO has said that it is extremely unlikely that the virus leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and so this whole thing about lab engineered versus natural occurrence. I mean, so what is your understanding of this? Is this a natural occurrence which really happened?
Yes. So what happens is that during evolution, viruses have evolved to be in all many different kinds of animals, birds, and so on and so forth. And in many respects, there are a lot of commonalities in the cell surface receptors of these animals, birds, and humans. And therefore, it would take only a small number of mutations to tweak the virus before it actually jumps from an animal or a bird into humans, right? So this virus is supposed to have jumped into humans by initially from bats into pangolins and in humans. That's what actually it is believed. But the conspiracy hypothesis that it was either deliberately leaked or an accidental leak is very, very unlikely. At this moment, I don't think we believe that it was an accidental or a designed leak of the virus from the lab. But that's only WHO is in a better position to address that. But most scientific community believes that it has been a random mutation that took place in a bat into pangolin and then in humans.
Okay. So coming back to India, I mean, we have such a large population with a significant number of people who live in very difficult conditions, close proximity to each other, unable to maintain social distance. And, and you also have talked about the hygiene hypothesis where exposure to pathogens in early stages, helps from fighting all these diseases, and immune training, which comes from chronic exposure to communicable diseases. So is this the best answer to explain, or one of the answers to explain relatively how Indians have fared well in this entire thing? Because cases have dropped to 10,000 per day now. So, and I mean, is this naturally that Indians, with all their living standards and hygiene?
Yeah. So, because I am a co-author of that study, so obviously yes, my answer is going to be yes. So, but others, the peers, will have to actually take a call on that whether they believe or not. I'll tell you what happens is that people are dying of COVID-19 not because of the virus, but because how the immune system reacts to the virus. See, in any viral infection, when an individual gets infected, it's by about the third or fourth day that the virus starts multiplying in the body after infection, and that rapidly the multiplication goes up. By something like 7th or 8th day, there is a peak of the replication of the virus, and by then the viral replication starts coming down because body's immune system has taken over, and body's immune system starts getting rid of the virus. So by about 10th or 12th day, the entire replication of the virus stops. And in fact, many people actually test RT-PCR negative on about 12th or 14th day after having contacted a virus. But something strange happens. On about 8th or 9th day, the body's immune system starts taking over, right? And body's immune system actually reacts to the virus that is there in the body. And there are multiple ways the body's immune system takes. So there's something called IgM, there's IgG, and so on and so forth. Now, people are not dying because the virus has replicated in the body. So because till about 10th or 12th day, people are actually perfectly, they have only minor symptoms, or if at all some fever or something. By something like 10th or 12th day, the oxygen levels and all start dropping down, right? And that's where body's immune system has started reacting to the virus. And in many people, there's a hyperimmune reaction that takes place. So the body's immune system overreacts to the virus. And most people die because of this overreaction of the immune system, what we also call in some other words cytokine storm and pneumonia-like symptoms. All of them happen because of the hyperimmune reaction of the body to the virus. Now that's a well accepted fact in the medical community, this particular fact. Now, if you ask a question that in many rich countries, more people have died, and in poorer countries, less people have died. So if you look at the death per million in richer countries is much higher. In poorer countries, it's much lower. And the hypothesis that we worked with was that in poorer countries, the immune system is so well trained for people that the immune system does not hyperreact to a new pathogen. While in the richer countries, the immune system actually hyperreacts to the pathogens. And a reminiscence of that, what we see are, for example, we are continuously exposed to pathogens in countries which have low hygiene and low human development index. While in countries which are very rich and high human development index, you don't see many infections, bacteria, fungi, and so on and so forth. But in those countries, the incidence for lifestyle diseases, Alzheimer's, diabetes, asthma, psoriasis is very high. Whereas you don't see that incidence high in low HDI countries. In the low HDI countries, we have higher incidence of TB, malaria, and so on and so forth. But autoimmune diseases, a reflection or a reminiscence of how people are dying to SARS-CoV-2 is much higher in high HDI countries or richer countries. And therefore, our hypothesis was, if we actually put all these parameters together, and when we did linear regression, we found that indeed in richer countries, this kind of factors are actually some sort of correlative factors where people are dying more because they have lived in super hygienic conditions and they have had actually higher percentage of autoimmunity, and they also have a better demography. That number of people above age of 65 are way more. The fraction of people above age of 65 are much more in countries such as US and Western Europe than the countries which are in Africa or Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. In fact, today's numbers suggest that this particular fraction of people living above 65 has dropped for the first time since World War II in the US. Significantly it has dropped because COVID-19 has taken a major toll on very elderly population. So all these things put together, it suggests that the immune system of people in poorer countries is better trained because these people are continuously exposed to different kinds of pathogens, and therefore their immune system does not hyperreact to a new pathogen such as SARS-CoV-2. Well, in richer countries, it's vice versa. That's the hypothesis that we have proposed, and we have done some correlative analysis. We have also been very careful. We say that correlations do not necessarily mean causation. They're two different things. So, thank you.
Fantastic. Also, Dr. Mande, you had had a mathematical supermodel to forecast the dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic in India, and you made some amazingly correct predictions. So would you like to just elaborate on this a bit?
Yes. So first of all, I have not been a part of that study, but I have been a privy to their results. The study is led by Professor M. Vidyasagar of IIT Hyderabad, and they have Professor Manindra Agarwal of IIT Kanpur and Lieutenant General Madhuri Kanetkar from Armed Forces. So, and they have their colleagues who are involved in that. So they were given the task about 6-7 months ago to build a mathematical model and predict how the disease is actually going to grow in India. And they did a fantastic job. They constructed a mathematical model on how many people are infected, how many people are recovering, and how the disease is spreading across the country. And this model has been actually very good in suggesting that the way they actually fitted their curves and so on and so forth, they have defined certain parameters, and something called a beta parameter, something called a reach parameter. and they actually tell you that how far the disease has reached, how many people the disease has reached. And the predictions are coming to quite fantastically. For example, in about sometimes about August, September, in that time, they said that about 10% of India's population has already been infected, whether symptomatically or asymptomatically. Many people did not even understand or realize that they have had the infection. So the Sero survey that was conducted by ICMR and independently by CSIR indeed seem to have matched those numbers. That about 10% of the people were seropositive. That means we had antibodies. These 10% people had antibodies in their body against the virus. That means the disease has reached 10% people. And that's exactly what mathematical model had predicted. The mathematical model now predicts that it has actually reached much farther on today's date. So according to their prediction, a large fraction of Indian population has already seen the virus, either symptomatically or asymptomatically. That's a good news. But mathematical models are models. They propose hypotheses, and at times real world can be different than mathematical models. And therefore, we should not drop our guard. We should be very watchful, and we should continue to maintain the same behavior that we have been doing, COVID appropriate behavior that has been recommended.
Dr. Mande, you head CSIR, and which has been, at quite a extent at the cutting edge in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'd like to know how did our scientists handle this enormous burden under your leadership that was thrust on them, in handling this and also in making an Indian indigenous vaccine?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I would not like to take any credit at all. I just happened to be here at the right time. The credit is due to entire Indian science and technology community. I'll give you some the way events as they unfolded. On 7th of February, I was giving a talk in Pune for the Firodia Memorial Lecture, and Dr. Mashekar was in the audience at that time. And I said on 7th February that we are living in the Corona era. And India's first case had only been detected on the 30th January. So 7 days later, I said that we are living in Corona area. What I want to say is that already there was an inkling in the scientific community that something serious is unfolding. On 25th and 26th February, all the CSIR laboratories, we have 37 laboratories across the country. One of them is in Goa, in fact, a jewel in the crown for all of us, National Institute of Oceanography. All the directors of 37 laboratories met in NIO in Goa. And then we deliberated upon, should this become a global emergency, how are we going to react to it? Now remember, WHO had not yet called it as a global pandemic. WHO declared it as a global pandemic only on 11th March last year. So in scientific community, there is a widespread feeling that we are onto something very serious. And therefore, India's scientific community was already preparing itself to react to the virus. Now this has happened because of years of investment in science and technology in the country. I think we should all be very proud that successive governments, irrespective of political affiliations, have continued to invest in science and technology in the country. And it has been phenomenal, right, over the years. Just to give one or two examples, the wind tunnel that was made in NAL Bangalore in the 60s and 70s led to a phenomenal growth of India's aerospace, phenomenal growth of India's space research. ISRO actually is a direct beneficiary of that, and phenomenal growth of India's defense. All the missile programs and all were built upon that wind tunnel that was made in NAL. That's the kind of infrastructure investment that has gone in science and technology over the years. And therefore, India's science and technology community has been prepared to face any kind of calamity that comes forth. And COVID-19 is no exception. So as far as the COVID-19 came, at least in CSIR, we formed a strategic group, and the strategic group rolled a strategy to combat it. And the strategic group started meeting every day. So from 25th March onwards, the strategic group met every evening at 6 o'clock. And every day we would discuss what we are going to do. We had a 5-pronged strategy. Number 1, we are going to do digital and molecular surveillance. Number 2, we are going to devise new diagnostics. Number 3, we are going to work on new interventions, drugs and vaccines. Number 4, we are going to make hospital-assisted devices. And number 5, we are going to supply chain model. We are actually going to evolve all of this. So it's a very holistic kind of a strategy, as you can see, a 360-degree view of the entire pandemic. And 25th March, we started working on it, mere 10 days after WHO declared as a pandemic. And because of that, we were able to very quickly, an entire CSIR rose to the occasion. And what a proud moment for the science and technology community, that all of science and technology community rose up to the occasion. The two fundamental principles that we said that we are going to work with, and without which we will not go ahead. Number one, we said that we are necessarily going to work with private industry. So unless there is a private industry with us, we will not even take development of a particular diagnostic kit or a drug or a vaccine from beginning. From day one, private industry has to say that we are interested in this. Number two, we said that every component that goes on making whatever we do, whether it be a diagnostic kit or a drug or a device, all components have to be made in India. We are not going to depend upon any import for that particular component. So based on this, the Indian industry is absolutely phenomenal. I personally wrote letters to about 50 industrial leaders in the country, some of the most best-known leaders in the country. And within 24 hours, I got responses from all of them. It's absolute phenomenon that was unfolding ahead of us in late March. That all the major industry leaders wrote to us saying that we are with you and we are going to work with you. So the diagnostic kit that we rolled out, it was Tata's who were working with us from beginning, what is called as the Feluda, the diagnostic kit based on something called CRISPR-Cas based system. The ventilator that we rolled out is Apollo and Bharat Forge. They worked with us from beginning. So we rolled out non-invasive ventilator. The drug that we rolled out, Favipiravir, that is available in the market. Cipla worked with us from beginning. The trials that we undertook, what is called as Sepsivac, Cadila Pharmaceuticals worked with us from beginning. So these are all the way actually different pharmaceuticals, different industries that we worked with us, and they have been actually principally responsible to translate our science and technology into the field. So we are very proud that the science and technology community and industry and the government rose to the challenge together. Years from now, when we look back upon how India dealt with the pandemic, I think it's going to be a very good chapter in the history that India actually rose to the occasion as one single country, all of us. Every individual in the country has risen up to the occasion, worked together, and we have made sure that our population is affected to a much lesser extent than many other advanced countries. So we should be all very proud of that occasion.
I must congratulate you, Dr. Mande, on providing the leadership and the guidance, for this to happen, and along with, of course, our Prime Minister and his Atmanirbhar belief. I think it has worked very well, and it's a moment for all Indians all over to be very proud of. I think it's a great thing what you have been able to do. Do you see scientific community worldwide also coming together for such pandemics in the future, or any calamities? I mean, did you work with other scientists worldwide, or was it basically more within ourselves only, just to make us self-reliant? Did you work with other scientists worldwide?
Yes, of course. So the thing is, we have been continuously exchanging notes with people from other countries. In fact, the closest that we have worked with is WHO, of course. The WHO has been in constant touch with Indian organizations, ICMR, CSIR, and so on and so forth. And we are continuously monitoring the situation with them as it unfolds. In fact, what kind of mutants are spreading where, and all WHO has been there. We have also been advising WHO on the new innovations that we have been doing. We have also worked closely with the US community, US scientific community, and they have had, so the principal scientific advisor in India to the government and the NITI Aayog member health, they have been continuously holding meetings with scientists around the world. We also have been involved in many of those meetings. So in a sense, world has come together for this particular pandemic. But what we are also preparing ourselves for any of such future pandemics together, and therefore we as entire humanity should work towards that particular one, and the talks are already on with scientists around the world how we are going to deal with future pandemics. There are much more serious problems which are staring at us. Climate change in which such parameter that's really staring at us very, very badly. And in fact, it has the potential to be way more worse than pandemics such as COVID-19. And therefore, the world scientific community is very concerned and is working towards finding solutions for all these problems together.
Thank you. Would you like to see more allocation of funds and resources for scientific research and development in India? I mean, how do we compare to China or USA and UK? I mean, are you happy with what is allocated, or would you like to have more in keeping with other, advanced nations or industrialized nations?
So I think this question is obvious answer. Any person you ask on the street, whether are you happy with the kind of money that you're earning, obviously person is going to say no, right? But we do sincerely believe that there is room to improve the funding of science and technology in the country. On today's date, India spends about 0.6 to 0.7% of its GDP on R&D in science and technology, but large part of it comes from public funding. What we would like to see in future is that the private industry starts spending more and more money in the R&D aspect. So that would be real achievement for all of us if we are actually able to convince industrial houses around the country to spend more money on R&D. And let me assure all the people that more we spend on R&D, the better chance that we have of coming up with solutions that benefit everyone. You know, in fact, even private R&D, there's a better chance of making wealth if you spend more money on R&D today. And many nations have realized this particular aspect. One of the most innovative nations, of course, is Israel that we see around. It's buzzes with innovations all around. But there are also countries like South Korea and so on and so forth who spend a lot of money on R&D, but the share of the private industry which invests on R&D is much higher there. So the science and technology community in India would like to see this share of funding going much higher. We would like the public funding to increase significantly, but at the same time, we also wish that the private R&D funding increases significantly in the coming time.
Dr. Mande, I think we have really crossed our time, and just wanted to change track and just close soon. We are quite happy to know your father was one of the first head of departments started at the Goa University. And would you like to talk about that? And, because we have a lot of Goan and we are based in Goa, and he made a great mark. So what was your first moments when you came to Goa with him, or how did he feel about Goa University?
I think Goa is an absolutely fantastic place. And it's a fantastic place, not because of its natural surroundings alone, but because there are fantastic people in Goa. It's amazing. I mean, the kind of warmth and love that we get every time I come to Goa, it's just simply amazing. Every time I come to National Institute of Oceanography, there's all warmth and things around us. In fact, when we used to come to Goa, when my father and mother were there, my father told me that when you go out of the house, you don't have to lock the house. You can leave the house open. In which part of the country you would see that? I mean, this is unheard of any part of the country that people trust each other, and that trust and the love that you get from people is just amazing. And I really like Goa for that particular reason. My father had very pleasant memories. He has very pleasant memories from being in Goa University. And in fact, he cherishes everything that he did in the Goa University. He was the first head of the Department of Physics when Goa University became independent from the Bombay University in the mid-80s. And some of his own colleagues continued. And they have very nice people even in physics department today, which actually continue the kind of work that he did. So his legacy actually lives on in the university. So he's very happy. Both my mother and father also love French, and Goa has actually a lot of French culture. I mean, of course, apart from Portuguese culture, of course, is the dominant culture, but even the French French-speaking people are quite a few. And in terms of arts and other things, also Goa is buzzing with activity. So overall, I think if anyone asks me what would be the best place that you would like to live ever, I would say, of course, it would be Goa.
That's a great thing for you to say. Thank you so much. Before we close, we've had this question for our other speakers also, and it's something to inspire all our youth and all. Dr. Mande, what are your 5 mantras, your personal mantras for what you have achieved, your success? I mean, a person like you could have done anything in the private sector or anywhere, but you're so happy doing what you're doing, and you achieved a lot in life. So what are your 5 mantras for your success?
Oh, that's a very, very tough question because normally I don't like to talk about myself. I just believe that there's been just series of accidents that happened and I reached wherever I am. I don't think it is any short of accidents because when one is doing 10th or 12th, one doesn't know what one is going to do in future. And okay, basically there's a series of accidents that I just chose to do BSc, MSc and not to go to engineering at that particular point of time. When one is doing PhD, one actually is confused which area of work that you would do, and the choices before me, I had admission to do radio physics in PRL Ahmedabad. I had admission to do fundamental particle physics in TIFA Mumbai and biophysics in IISc. It's just an accident that landed up in IISc. Similarly, I mean, by series of accidents, I just landed up here. So life takes you wherever. The only thing that we have tried to do, I mean, people like me have tried to do, and I'm sure that is true for almost everyone here in the audience, is whatever we do, we try to do to the best of our ability. We have our own shortcomings. We have our own strengths. We try to exploit our strengths. And whatever our shortcomings, we try to get over them by learning from our failures in lives and so on and so forth. And one is sincere to the cause, what we are doing. I think with bit of luck, one can always feel success at the end of the day. So that's what I mean. I don't have 5 mantras per se, but I will just say that be sincere to your job. And if you're lucky, who knows? I mean, opportunities are there plenty for everyone to grab the opportunities.
Thank you, Dr. Mande. Dr. Mande, we'll take a couple of questions. There's one from Dr. Pai. How far is it safe to meddle with mRNA without knowing its impact on evolutionary fitness, as they're told it may affect structural or functional genes?
So mRNA vaccines are now proven beyond doubt to be safe. Hundreds of thousands of people now have been injected these vaccines, both Pfizer as well as Moderna. They have not come to India yet, but in US and Europe, many people have taken these vaccines. They're perfectly safe. So I don't think there should be any doubt about any possible side effects of this. So a serious side effect. So no serious adverse effect has been yet recorded of any of the 2 vaccines. So we should be quite comfortable with these 2.
Another question from Amit Sharma from Bangalore. How long does the vaccine effect last after the first 2 doses are taken? Do we have to take this vaccine annually?
So as on today, what we believe is that after the taking first 2 doses, most vaccines are 2 doses, except Johnson & Johnson, which is coming in market, that is a single dose vaccine. But most vaccines are given on day 1 and day 28. And we believe that immune response lasts long. But because we are only in the 12th month of a pandemic right now, or rather 13th month of a pandemic right now, we'll have to wait and watch how long the immune response lasts. The vaccines have received an approval in late December. So people have started getting vaccinated only in late December around the world. So we'll have to wait and watch. We would like to believe that the immune response lasts long. In terms of immune response, there are 4 different kinds of immune responses that we talk about. One is circulating antibodies, one is memory B cells, one is CD4 positive B cells or T cells, and one is CD8 positive T cells. And T cells also offer actually a very powerful way of immunity against the virus. And we would like to believe for ourselves that this would last long. But it's watch game right now. Let time actually unfold itself and tell us whether that is true or not.
Okay. So I think we'll close now, Dr. Mande. Once again, thank you so much for an absolutely inspiring, educative, and informative session.
Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for giving us the gift of your time and able to elaborate on all the aspects. Our thoughts are very clear now. And I think the message has gone on that we should be careful and not take things for granted. So thank you so much and good night.
Good night. Thank you so much. Thank you. I enjoyed my interaction. Thank you.